We're delighted to be joined by Susan Glasser, who is from The New Yorker, a distinguished author, written with Peter Baker, her partner, a very good book, The Divider, and a biography. And I'm a huge fan of this, Susan, the book on James Baker, the former Secretary of State and Secretary of the Treasury and White House Chief of Staff. My goodness, that is a book from a different era. But we're here to talk about President Donald Trump and covering the president. And let's start, Susan, with one of your last columns, where you advised readers don't assume that the president is telling the truth and pay a lot of attention to late night posts or early morning posts. Why did you write those words?
Well, thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be with both of you today. Obviously huge admirer and, forgive me in advance for not always being able to explain the mystifying things that are happening here in Washington. But 10 years more or less into the Trump era in our politics, I do think one of the hard and fast rules that one might have for, let's call it Trumpology, is to pay close attention to what he is in fact ranting about, fulminating about on social media, late at night, early in the morning. Sleepless Donald Trump, you could say, under this framing, is the true Donald Trump. And, what has he been ranting about over the last week? Over and over again, he's been complaining about the faithlessness of our allies, suggesting that NATO is worthless, that there's no point to the alliance. And the reason that caught my attention is, as we all know, this is something that Donald Trump has always believed. And for him, he's not an ideologue in the conventional sense, but he has a few kind of idée fixe, a few, kind of obsessions that he comes back to again and again. In fact, if you can go back and read Donald Trump in a Playboy interview, of all things, from 1989, 1990, the end of the Cold War, that Donald Trump essentially had the same views about the world that this one does. And one of his most consistent through lines is a disdain for allies and alliances, and praise in many ways for our adversaries. And so to me, I just thought, this is the alarm bell. We never knew exactly how Donald Trump might go after NATO, but maybe, just maybe, it will end up being this very unlikely war of choice in the Middle East that provides him and those around him with the pretext they've been looking for to really further unravel and damage this alliance.
Susan, the difference, of course, with the first term is that the president is approaching 80 years old. And just look at him. I did interview him in that first term in 2017. I mean, he does appear to be behaving in a much more extreme fashion, rambling. And so the notion that, there's method in the madness, so to speak, may not actually hold good.
Well, I'm not sure it ever was accurate. In fact, I remember very vividly once being in a green room of a TV show with Chris Christie, at the time still Donald Trump's sort of friend and advisor, before they famously kind of broke up during COVID when Trump almost killed him. But Christie, I've always thought, is one of the sort of better Trump whisperers. And, he was listening to a couple other guests kind of talk about Trump's strategy and this, that, and the other thing. And he just couldn't help himself. And he interrupted. He said, "Listen, you guys don't understand. Donald Trump is not playing chess. He's not playing checkers even. This man has no strategy. He's just trying to get through the next 10 minutes of his day." And so I've always kept that in mind. But I do think this question is very legitimate, of course. Trump is the oldest president at this point in his term, and he is pushing 80 years old. It's very clear that by any kind of metrics you might throw against it, a man who never was all that coherent in the English language and in his political speeches has had an even harder time expressing himself. I mean, it was true in Trump 1.0 that if you listen to Trump, you would have a hard time finding a noun and a verb and a period. But what is happening now, as you pointed out, Lionel, is that he's talking longer and longer. People have measured this. The average length of his rally speeches ballooned from 2016 to 2020 to 2024. That's something that experts on seniors will say is very, very common. He's having a harder time regulating himself. He uses swear words in public much more often. Again, a sign of someone who's just having a harder time imposing any kind of self discipline on what he's doing and saying in public. And it's obvious, too, that he's more and more governed by whims and unchecked by people surrounding him. So some of it, I believe, is the kind of administration he has in his second term, as opposed to the kinds of people he had surrounding him in the first term. These are sycophants and enablers who are apparently unwilling to challenge him on most major issues. But it's also true that Trump visibly looks older, ailing. There's the mystery bruises on his hands. This is only going to get more serious, whatever the conditions are that Trump has. And I don't think we can trust that we are getting any kind of accurate medical picture of his condition.
So is the media holding back are there some taboos in the reporting regarding his health, in your view, as a long-time watcher?
I mean, look, we have an unfortunate tradition of many American presidents over the last couple hundred years not being fully forthcoming with the American public about the nature of their health. Think about the stories of Woodrow Wilson by the end of World War One, essentially not running the country at all. So this is consistent, unfortunately, with our tradition. However, Trump has aggregated to himself extraordinary personal executive powers. He has of questionable sort of competence at exactly the moment when he is imposing a form of one man rule by whim and decree that really has very few parallels in American history. In many ways, you could say on this 250th anniversary year of the United States since the Declaration of Independence, that Donald Trump is, aggregated to himself kingly powers. I think a lot of people around the world are looking at what's happening in the war in the Middle East right now and saying, how can it be that one man, without the mandate of the American people, without the mandate of the US Congress, without the support of its traditional allies and partners, that one guy is upending the world economy like this, that he's doing so much, right? Schools are having to close in Bangladesh once a week because of Donald Trump. Your energy bills are skyrocketing in the UK because of Donald Trump, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, I think it certainly matters. I believe the press has been very, let's just say, hard charging when it comes to covering Trump overall. It's stymied, of course, by a sort of a wall of impenetrability to a certain extent around this kind of court of the czar that we have established here. It's very hard to get that kind of information. It's also true that Donald Trump was very much benefited as he ran against Joe Biden, our other oldest president, because his mental issues were sort of papered over in a way by this impression of enormous kind of physical sheer bulk and power. And Donald Trump's favorite word is strength, and he projected in a strong way at that time. And I think for Biden, people made an intellectually quite problematic leap between Biden's increasing physical incapacity, right? The sort of the shuffling, the whispery, thin voice over time, and assuming that was also a sign of mental incapacity, which I think is much less clear. With Donald Trump, you have the assumed physical strength, again, making perhaps a very incorrect assumption on the part of many people that this sheer physical bulk of the man suggests that he retains a kind of mental vigor as well, which I think is a questionable proposition, but very hard to write about.
Let's use blunt language. Susan, let's say that Donald Trump is mad. One could break it down into a form of dementia or minimal attention span, narcissism, whatever it is, but he's not behaving normally. And as you say, some of the things he does at the fringes, which get less covered, but which turn up on social media, indicate quite a worrying trend. If that was your starting assumption, how would you cover this story differently? I mean, not you personally, but how should the American media cover the story differently? Because I think we're working to normal rules, assuming that this is a normal person, but he's not a normal person.
That's exactly right, Alan. And I think that's been, the big challenge from the very beginning with Donald Trump. I would argue that, in fact, one of the problems right now is that Donald Trump has always been an out of control narcissist who is acting in ways that are very incompatible with what our society considers to be normal, right? So to the extent, he's, to use your phrase, mad, he clearly always has been on some level a very psychologically out there character. It now seems to be amplified and accelerated by a combination of factors, one of which seems to be his aging, one of which seems to be the fact that he has now surrounded himself with an extreme group of enablers who are unwilling to provide any guardrails. And so it's that, putting those things all together here, right? It's not that he suddenly became mad, but that this the great flaws of his personality are now being magnified, as they often are, by age and other factors. And every day I look, and I'm sure just like both of you, I see something that gets my blood boiling about the kind of normalization of Donald Trump. It's been harder, it strikes me, since the beginning of this very disruptive 2026. You see less of that. I thought last year there was a lot of coverage here in Washington, to be honest, that was very shocking. The idea that so many people were stunned by what Donald Trump did when he came back into office in January of 2025 is a reflection on some level of a lot of failures in how he was written about, how he was talked about. And also, again, people consume the media that they consume, right? So this is not an indictment that is true on every platform, but I think a lot of Washington coverage, look, there's a couple of institutional failures that Trump and his people have exploited quite successfully over time. Number one is an adage that long predates Donald Trump, but here in Washington, people absolutely, they over prioritize things like ideology and partisanship, because that's what reporters and all the people who come to Washington care about. They care about policy fights and ideas and things like that. And so they tend to wildly overstate that. Well, if you write about policy fights divorced from, the man in the White House, you can make it seem much more normal that it's just a sort of Democrats and Republicans fighting with each other. So that has been something that Trump and his people have exploited from the very beginning, is that the odd normalcy of Washington fighting over issues. That's one thing. And then I just think Republicans, frankly, those who remained Republicans, have done a masterful job of really gaslighting all of us, and that includes a lot of the media, into, essentially don't pay any attention to that big, fat, ugly, naked emperor in the corner of the room. Let's have a conversation about tax policy. Let's have a conversation about this. Like, why are you so shrill? You're always complaining about the emperor. Like, oh no, I don't want to talk about the emperor. Wait, what? Why are you obsessed with the fact that he's naked? I mean, come on, you're just so obsessed about that. Does anybody really care?
To take your opening remarks when you said we should pay attention to late at night and early in the morning. I mean, there are 2 or 3 examples recently I can think of where on social media, I think social media in some ways does a better job of this than mainstream media. They will just use raw footage of Trump rambling. So he had a long ramble about the type of pencil he was using, or it was a Sharpie, and the cabinet is all standing there trying to keep a straight face as he talks for, maybe 5 minutes about Sharpies. Or there was one about the Saudi Arabian king having to kiss his ass the other day, or he'll interrupt.
Yeah, that's costume, Alan.
Or a big thing where in the middle of a press conference about the war, he will produce giant photographs of the ballroom and just start rambling about that. Now, I mean, they're completely off the main subject of the day, but in a way they're very revealing, because you think this is a man who, as you say, is completely incoherent, and much more so than in the past. But how, if you're editing a mainstream news organization, do you do that? How do you fit that into your coverage?
Yeah. Well, you're exactly right. These ramblings, they certainly, the cabinet meetings fit my definition of the courtiers paying no attention to the big, fat, ugly, naked emperor sitting at the head of the table, right? Because then when it's their turn to speak, they ignore the sort of manic fulminations of the guy, and then they just launch into their obsequious sucking up to him. So they refuse to engage with it, and that, I think, is part of the dynamic that is very clear if you show these clips, as is happening on social media, or like some of our late night comedians. I mean, this is what they do, is they just run clips of the guy talking. They don't have to do a lot of writing to show the joke. And I think it's also the case that, as with his social media postings, those appearances of Trump, they represent something very unusual in our politics, which is essentially as much access as you could ever imagine to the unfiltered id of an American president. And I think that's where the media over time has struggled and not covered that in the way that I thought they should. My view is that if you took the kind of more pay attention to Trump himself, pay attention to his ramblings and what he's saying, pay attention to the social media posts, what you might call the psychological school of analysis of Donald Trump. In my theory is that has proved to be more accurate over time than a lot of the inside baseball reporting, because that relies on access to self-interested courtiers. And so, you read a lot of those tip sheets that come out here in Washington, and sometimes they have really important and good scoops about what crazy new policy initiative is going to come out of the White House next, or what's going to happen. But in my view, they have been often very, very wrong over time, because again, they're relying upon access to kind of self-interested courtiers, rather than looking at Trump, who one of the things he does, if you pay close attention, is he loves to give the lie in public to whatever stupid excuse the people around him are making for him. And so this happens all the time, and this has been a facet of him, for the last 10 years. So, you'll be some Republican senator or Marco Rubio, and be like, "Oh, no, the president is deeply committed to, NATO and to our allies, and he really, he is deeply committed to, a vision of the future that involves the United States working together with friends and partners to be strong." And then Trump will, 10 minutes later post a, social media posting saying like, "As I've always believed, allies are worthless." And, you know, so again, how is the media uh, left to cover that? Some of it is structural. These guys are very adept at taking advantage of how beat reporters work and how news, quote unquote, is defined in Washington. But I will point out that as Trump has ratcheted up the crazy, and people have seen, especially since the beginning of the 2026 new year, that these are not just words, but actions that are flowing from this very kind of volatile leader. um, not so many people are buying the ruse. I think the media is overall reporting in a very strong way about the things that the Trump administration doesn't want us to know. Look, for example, at the terrific reporting and important reporting of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, ProPublica, and others about the extraordinary grifting and personal financial monetization of the White House that Donald Trump's family, that Steve Witkoff's family have been undertaking over the last year. It's that kind of reporting, I think, that contributes in an invaluable way to the public image. And,
Susan, can I just come in on this question of access, because he's taken it to a totally new level, and there are real problems with the 7-minute chat. I mean, we're seeing headlines every day almost to the Daily Telegraph when Trump wants to have 3 bites at the Prime Minister Keir Starmer, but it's not an interview. Or can you talk a little bit about that dilemma for the media?
yeah, thank you for asking about that. I think you're exactly right. We've seen in the last couple of weeks Trump, just sort of answering his personal unsecure cell phone all the time with, various reporters who now have his phone number. Everybody in Washington at this point seems to have his phone number, not to mention around the world. It's obviously been an intelligence goldmine, by the way, for our adversaries for many years, even before he was granting these interviews. In Trump's first term, I would talk to Republicans who were deeply concerned about his penchant for having really sensitive conversations on the phone like that. But I think you're right. Donald Trump has always been something of a media savant, and this to me is another way that he is very successfully manipulating the media. He used to delight in his first term when he would post a tweet on Twitter, and then he would be sitting there with a guest and he would watch the news of this tweet flash across the chyron on the cable news that he is constantly washing. And this is a new form. This is the Trump 2.0 form of that tweet, right? It's a quick adrenaline hit for the media junkie Donald Trump, and he can just answer his phone at any moment. There'll be some reporter, he doesn't even know who they are, half the time. He'll just, give a quick rant, and then boom, it's a headline for him. And look, the media is fragmented. There's always going to be somebody who's going to dial that number, who's going to take advantage of that opportunity to have access to the president of the United States. And he's proven again and again and again that one of his real claims to genius is in his ability to both manipulate and control the news cycle.
What I mean, do you think that some of the coverage of Donald Trump amounts to sane washing? We impose a coherence on him that isn't there, and by doing that, we're artificially distorting the reality.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm talking about, the big, fat, naked emperor in the room. This is the same guy who's been there for 10 years, Alan, and it's, been hard to be here in Washington and to see, the various cycles repeating themselves over and over again. You know, remember this though, that through his successful manipulation of the media, through telling many, many American citizens things that they want to hear over the last decade, you know, Donald Trump would be just a crazy naked dude, or in my other analogy I love to use, he'd just be some angry old man shouting at the television, in the grill at his men's club in between golf rounds, if it weren't for the fact that millions and millions of people have supported him, okay? And that's the thing that makes Trump, so scary, is that he's established a connection with millions of Americans. Again, it's a minority of the country, but the way our system is set up, a minority of the country, which is now shrunk down to sort of its core of, a little bit more than a third of the United States, if you look at the polls, basically are the hardcore supporters of Donald Trump. And, that's the thing that's really problematic. There are crazy, narcissistic, angry old men in every society. What does it say about our society that we have not only allowed this one to take power in our country, but to have so much unchecked power to really wreak havoc inside the United States and around the world?
What should we be doing with all the lying? I think you've written that you should more or less assume that he is lying rather than telling the truth. But it's a challenge for news organizations, isn't it, to just cope with the sheer volume of falsehood?
Absolutely. And of course, one of the differences between the first and the second term is that many news organizations have simply given up, Alan, in even trying to account for the almost pathological untruth that is coming from the president and his administration. And so, for example, in the first term, the Washington Post had a fact checking project, and they came up with a number of more than 30,000 uh, misstatements, untruths, falsehoods from Donald Trump in the course of his first 4-year term in office. Well, the Jeff Bezos owned Washington Post, and Trump 2.0 has disbanded that fact checking effort. The fact checker himself has left the paper, and I think that is overall reflection of the direction a lot of the American media went in the second term, which is basically to throw up its hands and to stop even trying anymore to hold him to account for the misstatements, the falsehoods. And you've asked me several times in this conversation, understandably, about the kind of normalizing of Trump. I think this is one of the biggest areas where that's happened, and you'll see many of these kind of Washington insider publications, they will, they've adopted a sort of, I don't know, postmodern theory of Donald Trump, right? Where it's not a lie. It's just, his feelings about things. And, that I think hollows out our democracy in a lot of ways and is a real symptom of the crisis. So how should they handle it? I don't think they should give up on fact checking. I think it was a really important project for history itself uh, to document all the lies coming from a president. And I'm sad that the record of Trump's second term will not include that.
My final question, Susan, is about the degree to which some of this is working, in the sense that we've seen a pattern beginning which feels reminiscent of people who've been studying, say, Hungary, in which friends of the president acquire media organizations, and then the media organizations are then more compliant. And there have been a lot of legal threats, which again seem some media organizations have buckled at, and others haven't. I mean, how much should we be worried about America of all countries a media that we thought was protected by the First Amendment and was a sort of example to the world, the concessions that have already been made, if I can put it like that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. It was really remarkable moment when the man who was appointed to chair the Federal Communications Commission by Donald Trump just last weekend was absolutely, uh, cheering what he saw as the successful purging of non-Trump voices in very important mainstream news organizations that have now been either outright taken over by explicit Trump supporters or have been neutered in some way as a result of needing to seek the Trump administration's approval for takeover deals, things like that, that they've essentially used their control over the federal government in order to uh, basically compromise a wide array of news organizations in just a very short time. That's the other thing. I think no one would have really anticipated that it was possible. You look at, ABC and CBS News, basically paying millions of dollars to the president for spurious lawsuits where he made ridiculous claims that never would have really held up in court given our First Amendment protections, and yet nonetheless they paid the money and compromised their independence because they wanted something else from the administration. You now have CBS News taken over by an explicit supporter of the president. There's a possibility CNN may now be taken over by the same person. Jeff Bezos, I mentioned earlier, in the course of Trump's 2 terms, has now become openly a favor seeker and seems to be willing to destroy the Washington Post in order to get whatever it is he wants from the Trump administration. And I think it's a reminder of the dual crises intersecting, right? We have this crisis about the future of the media and its business models and artificial intelligence and all of that really unfolding in quite a rapid way at the same time as you have a political actor who is willing to use the instruments of the American federal government for his own personal financial and political interests in a way that basically is incompatible with all the thrust of efforts toward good government in the United States ever since the Watergate scandal in the U.S. in the 1970s. I mean, Donald Trump has sort of eliminated many of what we saw as the protections that would stop a corrupt and rogue president from treating the government as his personal preserve. And I think you're right. It's not just Hungary, but it's, Russia and many other countries around the world where crooked oligarchies are the enablers of would-be authoritarian leaders. And, I know people love to make the Hungary analogy, but, the United States is a vast country, far different than Hungary, which is a, small country of, I believe, under 10 million people, right, in Europe. The United States, 300 plus million people, where the president of the United States has the ability, if he wakes up one morning, to unleash global economic mayhem and, war with consequences for virtually billions of people around the world. So obviously the consequences of having a corrupt oligarchy in the U.S. are very, 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 very different. And I just, it's not that I'm not agreeing that there are some echoes there with Hungary, but I feel like the scale of it means that analogy can often be overused.
Yeah. I wish there was a cheerful note on which to end, but I'm slightly lost to one at the moment. But anyway, Susan, thank you so much for joining us on Media Confidential, and we will continue to read and admire your work in the New Yorker.
Thank you so much, Alan. It's wonderful to be with you and Lionel.
Thank you. This interview was from the latest episode of Media Confidential, a podcast brought to you by Prospect Magazine. To listen to the full episode, click on the link below. And if you want full access to Prospect Magazine, go to prospectmagazine.co.uk.